So I'm Matthias Worch, and I'm a lead designer at LucasArts. I'm not at Visceral Games anymore, as you might have seen in the schedules. So I'm currently working on an unannounced game at LucasArts with Clint Hocking and Kent Hudson, but obviously I can't talk about that yet. So these are some of the games I did work on. I really want to thank all of you guys coming to this talk on a Friday morning, because Friday morning at GDC usually feels like, Saturday or Sunday morning during regular times. I figure the only way we can really deal with this is to just fucking own it, right? Acknowledge the fact our mental state is probably like that of a 6-year-old right now, and, well, pretend it's Saturday morning. To me, that means watching Saturday morning cartoons, right? Maybe we can do this while people are still filing in and getting seated. So grab some breakfast, and I actually do have a cartoon here that I want to watch while everybody's filing in. Let's see if this works. No sound, but hey. Can we try to get the sound up?
My Pony Express stamps. You'll ruin my Pony Express stamps. Not to mention 5 years of therapy. Get out of my room.
Jeez, what a grump. He should really try to find some outlet for those negative feelings. It looks like all the ink's disappeared now.
Get out of here. Hey, you fixed it. I guess I can forgive you now.
Sometimes I do stupid stuff and I don't even know why. As if my body were being controlled by some demented, sadistic puppet master.
Well, we all feel that way sometimes.
Alrighty, so this talk is called The Identity Bubble, and I build it as a design approach to character and story development. On a deeper level, it's actually about what you just saw in the video, right? It's about identity concepts in games, understanding them and using them to full effect. And more specifically, it's a talk about motivation and how writing for games is different from writing for other media. And I figured I could have filled slide after slide with examples of bad game writing, bad game identity. In fact, I did that at one point, but I realized that really I only have to give you one example, and that's from a game that I worked on like 4 years ago, which was Lair. So Lair had this huge disconnect between the player and the player character. As I was playing the game, I didn't believe while in the mission, I didn't believe in the reasons why I was doing things. And it culminated in this mission, I think somewhere halfway in the game, where you're bombing this supposedly evil city. And the player character, the avatar, is going at it with gusto. He's totally into it. Except as the player, I've already realized that's exactly the wrong thing to do. Those guys aren't evil at all, and that mission fell completely flat. So this is a somewhat personal talk, because ever since Lair, I've been looking for help in this area. And I think the problem we have in this industry is that we don't even seem to be able to agree on what the actual problem is, right? So what I've come to realize or think is that it's not a singular problem. There's actually two distinctly different approaches to character creation. And both have their own philosophical baggage attached. They all have their own ideologies, which makes it kind of difficult to talk about the subject, right? Because it's kind of divisive. I'm probably going to split the room right down half the middle. I'm going to split the room right down the middle. Because, for every Fallout, as a Final Fantasy, whatever fucking number they're up to. For every Portal, there's an Uncharted 2, right? In both cases, there's very different approaches to player identity. So what I'm going to try to do here is dig up the commonalities, like unearth the foundation that these games are based on, and try to reconcile those different identity approaches into something that hopefully we can use as a framework. So I'm going to do this in 5 parts. In part 1, I'm going to establish an identity range. It's going to be this graph that captures both extremes of how we may choose to author player identity. And part 2 is going to look at double consciousness, understanding it and seeing why it makes writing for games different from other media, and then hopefully using that knowledge to create some good player identity. And that's what part 3 is going to be about. I have 3 specific examples, kind of showing you how we can use those lessons. And then part 4, which is actually wedged into part 3, because it kind of flows in there, is about myth reinforcement, what it means and how we can use it to make better stories. And then part 5 is going to be takeaway, and we're going to see if we can learn some lessons from all of this. So we're going to start by talking about identity approaches. And to do that, we should talk about avatars. So I think we all know that we use avatars to enter a game world, right? And it's usually an abstract concept, but Ultima, the beauty of Ultima was that it's actually an awesome example of exactly how this school of thought looks at the player-avatar relationship, right? Rules of Play has a definition for this, and it describes the avatar in this identity approach as, quote, a puppet, an object for the player to manipulate according to the rules of the game. I think we all easily understand what that means. We treat the avatar as a lifeless puppet, as our extension into the world, and then we project ourselves onto this puppet. Puppet doesn't have any character traits or opinions of its own. It's literally that of the player. So this analogy works really good for games with weakly defined characters, right? And usually these games put a really high premium on high agency and on the player story. So in my identity range, I'm going to put it on the left side, right over there. And while this is a very common approach to player identity, especially early on, this doesn't tell the whole story, right? Especially recently, there's this exactly opposite approach where we use strongly characterized, fully fleshed out avatars who have their own motivation and their own backstory, like Nathan Drake, right? I mean, he's not really a puppet. Yes, every so often I play him, but he talks, he sets directions, he adds in cutscenes, he goes after the girl, a lot of stuff that I, as the player, don't actually affect. So that's a completely different approach to authoring player identity, and we need to understand that one as well. So a great metaphor I have found for this approach comes from Nick Montfort, and it's from this essay, Threading the Player Character, and it was published in this book, Second Person. So what Nick Montfort is saying is that the player is steering the avatar like, quote, a sort of vehicle from which the world can be seen and otherwise experienced. This character both constrains us, we have to remain in the vehicle, and also opens up possibilities. We can use the vehicle to get around and even affect changes in the world. So what I love about this analogy is that it completely visualizes how an active cinematic experience like Uncharted 2 works. Right? Uncharted 2 is very strongly structured. It's locking the player into this very specific story progression. So if we visualize this structure as a road network, which is connected by tunnels, which of course represents the story cutscenes and the structural points that structure the experience, we can see that we're driving Nathan Drake across the road, right? That's him driving right there. And it shows us that there is some choice and expression that we have during play, but it also shows us the limitations, right? We cannot drive off the map in whatever direction we choose to, and our progression is predetermined. It's always gated by these tunnels, which connect each piece of the road. So in our identity range, we're going to put vehicles on the opposite side right here, and I think these are two really good cornerstones to anchor our spectrum. So regardless of how we look at it, if it's the player exerting his will on a puppet, or if it's the player driving a vehicle through an experience, the one thing we have to always keep in mind is that player and avatar always remain separate entities. This is something that Rules of Play calls double consciousness. It's this idea that players, even when they're fully immersed in an experience, are always aware of the fact that they're playing a game, and that in playing a character, they're always manipulating an artificial construct. So what's interesting about this is that the player himself establishes this double consciousness, right? Because he makes the choice to enter the magic circle of the game. He chooses to push aside parts of his identity that will prevent him from enjoying or acting appropriately within the game. So in a way, the player willingly turns himself into schizophrenic, and he willingly submits himself to all these different voices, which different points of views and different agendas, which are all whispering inside his head. So and this is probably the key to this topic. As game writers and game designers, we need to understand double consciousness. And this knowledge is out there. It's in multiple books. It's in multiple GDC talks. The reason, I think, why we still don't really seem to have an institutionalized knowledge in this industry is because it's a little bit difficult to understand. Because double consciousness is multi-layered. It's kind of like a dream within a dream within a dream. And even in this lecture, we have to drill down into the concept not once, but twice. So if we dig deeper into double consciousness once, we get to Gary Fine and the book Shared Fantasy. So this was a book that was written, I think, even in the 70s. It's about real-life tabletop RPG groups, but it applies to digital games as well. And Gary Fine splits double consciousness. Well, the chronology is wrong here, but we can say he splits double consciousness into three parts of identity that players experience when they're playing a game. So we have the character. This is the fictional character embodied by the player, Ulga the dwarf or whoever he chooses to play. Then we have the player. So this is the player himself, acting within and exploring the framework and the rules of the games, like rolling dice and actually understanding the rules and using them. Then we also have the person. And this is the player as a person with life demands, which we push aside while we're playing, right? We're trying to immerse ourselves in Olga the Dwarf or whatever. But they're never forgotten, because if I have to leave at 6 p.m. and have to catch a train, that's always going to be somewhere on the back of my conscience. So there's this inherent ambiguity here, right? On the one hand, we have the player actual, the way we usually talk about the player and what he does, but you also have this identity frame player. So what I'm going to try to do for the rest of this talk to avoid ambiguity is to call Gary Fine's identity part the player, and whenever I'm talking about the player actual, I'm going to try to call him gamer, so we have a distinction right there. We'll see how well I succeed, because this is totally ingrained in me as well, like saying player. So in psychology, I guess we call these frames. It's the character frame, the player frame, and the person frame. And these are those schizophrenia-induced voices that I was talking about, which are whispering to the player inside his head. Right? These are voices that want to be satisfied. They have their own goals. They have their own motivations. And if you want to know how to motivate somebody, how to keep them satisfied, we need to know what defines them, right? How we actually hook into them. So this is where we drill one level deeper into double consciousness, and where it gets a little bit weird. It doesn't get weird because of this guy. This is Harvey Smith. He's the co-creative director at Arcane Studios in Austin. And last year I had the good fortune of doing a lecture on environmental storytelling with him. But before that, 2006 I believe, Harvey did a talk called The Imago Effect, which a lot of the material so far actually has been based on. It kind of opened up my eye to all of that. So in this talk, Harvey psychoanalyzed Gary Fine's identity frames, right? And he came up with a more detailed list. We could call these frames as well, because this is all incredibly fractal, but then we would have frames inside frames. So what I'm going to try to do is call Harvey's list fragments. So these are Harvey's identity fragments, and you can see them on the screen right here. So if we take this list, we just slightly adjust it, we can map Harvey's identity frames back onto Fine's Harvey's identity fragments, and we can map them back onto Fine's identity frames. And we come up with something like this. Right, where we have the character, which is the fictional protagonist of the game, and he might be based on a literary, pop, or mythic archetype. Then we have the player, and this is the player himself solving problems and completing tasks. So this talks about moment-to-moment gameplay, right? Really tight motivational loops, pure games pretty much, the reason why we start playing them. Then we have the player with a sense of skill level and reputation, and I'm using this to kind of map his sense of mastery and his progress as he's going through the game, kind of tracking how far along we are in the entire game. And then we have the player who just brings primal emotions like fear, anger, and various other things into the experience. So character and player exist within the magic circle of the game, right? When we're playing the game, that needs to be there. Then we also have the person who usually exists outside the magic circle. So we have the person as a player with a sense of skill level and reputation, but I don't want to talk too much about that. We're going to ignore that one. But we do have the person who has a perceived sense of idealized self, right? We all like to see ourselves in a certain way. We all aspire to be somebody. So this is who we want to be or how we think other people perceive us. And of course, we do have the self as a person with life demands who has to catch the bus at 6 or various other things that just define our life. So we're going to ignore the person frame for the time being, right? I mean, this is double consciousness deconstructed, right? This is your player when he's playing the game. But because the person exists outside the magic circle, and it's going to make it a little bit more difficult to figure out the concepts and talk about them, we're just going to forget about them for the time being. So the concept behind the identity bubble is just reconciling those identity fragments. It's this idea that we can imagine identity in games as a bubble in which character and player followed along. And identity during play is maintained when the character and the player frames drift in the same direction, right? But as soon as one of them lags behind or starts floating in a completely different direction, the bubble pops and identity is lost. So what's important to me is that this identity bubble needs to be maintained, because we have to do that both during runtime, right? We have to keep reinforcing identity as we're playing, but this also includes development. I mean, to me, writing for games means cooperation between writer and designer for the entire duration of development. We can actually see that right here in the bubble, because we have a representation for both the writer, right, he's down there, caring about the character, and for the game designers as well, who are up there and caring for, the actual player experience. So this practice of hiring a writer towards the end of development just to write the story doesn't work. And more importantly, hiring a writer who doesn't understand player identity is going to open this huge can of worms. And, well, hopefully you can use this talk to, teach some people. So, because I think in this room, we all understand this. I mean, at least intuitively, but it doesn't really protect us from an executive coming in and having hired this famous comic writer, something like that. So every time that happens, we kind of need to figure out how to deal with that. And I think one way to actually do that, if you are in this situation, is to just very quickly talk about what makes writing for games different from writing for other media. Like, my high-level summary is actually very simple. Games are participatory, and movies and books are reflective. Let me show you what I mean by that. So this is linear media, right? This is a movie. And in linear media, motivation is created in a character frame. Like, it's created over there. I will take the ring tomorrow. This is propelling the entire experience forward. So now we have the player, which in this case, of course, is the viewer, and he's observing the character's actions on the screen, right? He's doing this right here. This is the reflective part. The viewer compares his own values, his own frame of reference, to the depicted situation. So meaning emerges because the viewer is engaged in his internal dialogue about what's happening on the screen, right? Like, in this case, he's edging Frodo on. Go, Frodo. But he's also reflecting on himself. He's going, you know what? If I was a hobbit, I could do exactly the same thing. I wouldn't succumb to the ring. So it's kind of self-assuring, or, we're testing ourselves to see if what's going on the screen would be true for us as well. This is actually very straightforward. If we're looking at the flow of consumption that's going on here, and it's pretty straight, and we've mastered this over thousands of years. There's a bunch of experience, like the never-ending story here, which played with this character-viewer relationship in kind of interesting ways, but ultimately, this experience is always reflective. And that's awesome, except that games don't work that way. They actually work pretty much oppositely. Games are participatory. We're looking at motivation in games. Well, it's created in the player right over there. That's the reason we play games, right? We want to drive the action. We want to express ourselves. We want to lead. What becomes tricky is that now we want to use storylines and character motivation to fictionalize the player's goals. So all of a sudden, we're creating motivation over here as well. So now the player starts reflecting on the character's actions until he realizes, well, wait a second, why am I reflecting? I actually am the character. So I don't know, what the fuck does that mean? So we have this duality, right, where motivation is created in one identity frame. There's a different identity frame we use to fictionalize this motivation, and we need to figure it out. So the result of this is a very confused player, right? And we've all been there. We've all had this nagging feeling of, why am I doing this again? Right? It's this feeling of not really feeling like you're driving the action, of not really understanding why the character is doing something, not really caring about the avatar's motivation. So there's actually a term for this hollow feeling, of disconnect that Clint Hocking came up with a few years ago. So I guess he's a kind of questionable character, the way I put this up. But Clint called this feeling ludonarrative dissonance, right? It came out of talking about Bioshock. So ludonarrative dissonance is something that we as designers and writers create when we don't understand player identity, right? We open this rift between player and character, and we don't even understand it's there, and we don't know how to manage the problem. Because it is a manageable problem, and that's what the identity bubble is about, right? It's just this expression of the problem. It's the idea that we have to keep all identity frames aligned by somehow hooking them together so they keep drifting in the same direction and keep the bubble from popping. And the way we do this is by controlling this identity gap, being aware of it, and then doing something about it. So there's 3 examples of how this can be done that I want to look at. So this is us hooking them together. What's nice about it is that all 3 examples coincide with this identity range that we established earlier. What's important to know about this range is that it's completely analog, right? Your approach might be wedged somewhere in the middle. You might not be making a pure puppet or pure vehicle game. You might be the pure crash test dummy, like somewhere right in the middle. But so the 3 approaches I want to talk about is to either create what I would call ludonarrative parity, right, using a puppet avatar. We might be using a hybrid approach, using something like complementary goals, which goes somewhere in the middle. Or, if we want to use a strongly characterized avatar, well, we might have to change the player's expectations of why he plays the game in the first place. And we do that using a mythic archetype. So I think the best way to talk about this is to just look at examples for each case here. And then once we're done, hopefully we can find some commonalities and then specific tools and takeaways. So we should start by looking at puppet games. Not this puppet game, unfortunately. It would be awesome. I'm talking about these kind of puppet games, right? The idea behind ludonarrative parity is to align gameplay and story goals so closely that the player's agency is synonymous with the game's narrative progression. And anybody who's looked into this topic knows exactly which game I'm going to use now as an example. It's going to be Portal. because it's a great example of ludonarrative parity. So I'm not here to analyze Portal and how it creates gameplay per se, right? Countless people have done that before me. I just want to show how the game engages the different fragments of player identity. So this is me playing Portal, right? So if I'm playing Portal, well, I want to get to GLaDOS, right? Because that means I finished the game. I do that by finishing each test chamber, right? Which means solving all the puzzles in each chamber with the gameplay mechanisms provided to me. Now for all of this, GLaDOS keeps talking to me and keeps deriding me, creating this sense of anger and a sense of indignity as she talks to me, edging me on to get to the very end of this and, well, killing that computer bitch, right? Because she needs to die. So if we compare this to what the avatar wants to do, and her name is Chell, by the way, but that's not important. What's important is that you probably didn't know that, and her name isn't important, right? Well, Chell wants to get to GLaDOS because she wants to get out of this fucked up situation that she's in, right? She wants to be free. So she does this by finishing each test chamber, which means solving all the puzzles in each chamber with the tools provided to her. And through all of this, GLaDOS keeps talking to her. She keeps deriding her, which reinforces this anger and this sense of indignity that's been inflicted through her capture, giving her the righteous fury to get to the end and kill that fucking computer bitch, right? So both examples are pretty much identical. They're remarkably similar. So in Portal, there's never an identity gap because the game maintains ludonarrative parity. What it means to play the game is exactly the same thing as what it means to be Chell in that situation. So player and avatar united in a situation, well, they're incarcerated by a sadistic computer, right? And they have this overwhelming urge to escape in the hope of sticking it to GLaDOS in the end. So the player knows exactly what it's like, what it means to be the avatar, what his or her motivation is, and how to act on that motivation. That's the important part right here. So if we're looking at the identity bubble here, we see this ludonarrative parity, right? Because player and character are pulling each other along. Both identity frames are working towards exactly the same game, the same goals. So the bubble never pops, at least for me, and identity is strong. So fictionally, Chell is her own person, I guess, but in gameplay terms, she's identical to the player. And if we are looking at the writing of Portal, during the entire game, GLaDOS' commentaries addressing player and character alike, right? There's no gap. And the brilliance of Portal's writing, beyond just having really good characterizations, all that stuff, is that it's constantly reminding the player of the shared situation, right? It's constantly keeping these identity frames aligned. Every time GLaDOS addresses Chell or the player, whatever, it reminds them that they're both the same, and it kind of starts hooking these frames together again, even though they might have drifted apart a little bit. So ludonarrative parity works in Portal, I think mostly because it's both based on primal motivation, right? It's something we inherently understand, something we don't like. There aren't even objectives in Portal. You know, GLaDOS talks at us, but mostly every goal in the game flows from this primal motivation of getting to the end. And things get a little bit trickier when we want to add external, like more nuanced motivation, something with bigger ideas. And if we want that to drive the story progression. Because now we're talking about this duality that I talked about earlier, right? Where we motivate one identity frame with gameplay, but then another identity frame is used to contextualize that motivation somehow. So one way we can deal with this problem is complementary goals, right? We want to weave the player's identity into the core gameplay loop. And to me, Fallout 3 is a great example of this. In Fallout 3, the avatar, him or herself, is also an empty vessel. I think even more so than in Portal because we can customize our avatar, right? Both statistically and visually. So Portal's gameplay is driven by the player. It's his motivation to explore the world for resources. It's the joy of systemic advancement, which just means, gaining levels and that kind of stuff. I mean, that's why we play the game. When we pick it up, that's what we expect. The problem is that this systemic exploration doesn't drive Fallout 3's story, right? Because that goal is introduced externally over here in the character. As Fallout 3's pre-authored story goes, the avatar wants to find her dad. And once she's successful, she wants to help him on his quest to bring clean water to the wasteland. So this opens up this identity gap if we don't deal with it, because those goals, they're not fundamentally derived from Fallout's gameplay mechanics, right? And beyond experience points, which I guess are a motivator, helping my dad on his quest doesn't really reward me on a systemic level. So in the identity range, Fallout falls somewhere right in the middle, right? It's a puppet that the player completely controls, projects himself on, but this puppet does have this pre-authored backstory, which establishes fundamental gameplay goals. So Fallout 3 deals with the setup, well, when it comes to base motivation, in a very clever way, because it establishes the father very early on as an instrumental figure in the gamer's life. Like, he's literally the guy who teaches us how to deal with the world. He delivers all the tutorials. When you're beginning Fallout 3, growing up, and he teaches you how to walk, how to jump, gives you a name and all that stuff. So once the dad goes missing, we actually care about his fate a little bit, because at least we know him and he's helped us. But that only takes us so far once we're out on our own and we're in the capital of the wasteland, and the world is our oyster, and there's tons of open world points of interest which are available to me, and I could do whatever the hell I want. So at this point, Fallout needs to do more to maintain this identity bubble, making sure that the character's quest match the player's gameplay actions. So it does this by making player and character actions fundamentally complementary. All right? As a player, building up an RPG character in a post-apocalyptic wasteland means what? It means scrapping and exploring. All right? I'm going around, I'm finding shit, I'm digging it up, I'm killing guys. As a fictional character, looking for my dad somewhere in the wasteland in a post-apocalyptic world, well, it means scrapping and exploring, because I don't want to die and I'm looking for him. I'm just digging up the entire wasteland. So we create alignment right here, and it's not ludonarrative, it's not parity, right? But it's harmony. Ludonarrative harmony, because the character's identity is mirrored in the game's fundamental systemic play actions. Like, even if the player doesn't care about finding her father, she still kind of follows the story anyway, because, you know, she does it by automatically by exploring the wasteland. So this spatial exploration of the wasteland, which ties together all the other gameplay mechanics, hooks player and character identity frames together. Right? And we see this right here in the identity bubble. So the player explores to go in power, the character explores to find her father. And every time we enter a new location, even if we're off the beaten path, we are reminded of our story goal. I've actually talked to somebody, I think last year, who told me he sidestepped like 60% of the main quest because he completely ignored it and just found his dad by accident somewhere where he's actually hiding, like way off the beaten path. And I think that's awesome, right? I mean, we didn't destroy the story in any way. We were playing the story the entire time. It's just our player story, and we managed to play it in a way nobody else did. So this is exploration, and we're fundamentally weaving the character identity into play actions, but I think there's actually something else that holds together this identity bubble in Fallout. And it's something you might not expect in this context. It's the American dream. If we're looking at what Fallout 3's gameplay arc really represents, it's actually the typical story of the American dream. It's rags to riches. It's coming from nowhere and going somewhere, right? You have the freedom of what you want to do, and there's a promise of prosperity and success if you do it right. The sky, well, level 20 is the limit, right? But the sky is the limit, and that promise is expressed in the character and in the player equally. Oops, sorry. I lost my slides here. Let's go on back. I mean, a character enters the capital wasteland as nobody, working our way up to the top. As the player, we're grinding. We're putting in all the hard work. We're doing fetch quests and all the stupid little stuff you do in RPG games. All the hard work, and, you know, we're making something out of ourselves. So there's alignment right there, and we're both growing in power equally. What's cool about it is that it brings the person frame back into the picture. Right? I mean, I kicked them out earlier because the person frame wasn't needed. It just made it easier to understand or to deal with it, but this is where we can bring it back. Because as a person, if we're talking about the American dream and how we know about it, well, it's something that we know as a person, right? It's something that we want to believe in. It's something that's very prevalent in our culture. So we're playing an activity like Fallout 3, and this proves to ourselves that all these values that we hold dear, that we want to believe in, they might actually be true. You know, I'm not a dishwasher. I came here like 13 years ago. I didn't start washing dishes. But hey, maybe I can become a millionaire too. And playing something like that, well, it stays with me, right? After I stop playing. It actually transcends the game. It reinforces our beliefs. And this is something that's going to become more important as we go on. So I actually want to explore this in more detail before we come back to the third example right here. So this is my former boss at Legend, Bob Bates, who's sitting right over there. He did a talk in 2005 called Into the Woods, a practical guide to the hero's journey. And he presented this idea that, just like other media, by the way, quote, games are essentially myth-reinforcing activities. And I believe that players tend to choose the kinds of games that reaffirm their own personal myths, end quote. So Bob then goes through this talk, or the first part of the talk, and he quotes the who is who of the psychological world to show that the reason why we consume media is a way to reaffirm our own personal belief systems of the world. Right? It's the reason we have fairy tales. It's the reason why small children watch Disney movies until they can recite them backwards. It's the reason my wife watched Sweet Home Alabama about 100 times, because it was reassuring her that Mr. Right was out there somewhere just waiting for her. Well, then she met me, but that's a different story. It's the reason you guys can't get enough of Die Hard, and it's the reason I literally watched the San Francisco Giants win the 2010 World Series like 20 times. I have it on DVD and I have a subscription because that was fucking cool. I mean, my hometown Warriors, my San Francisco Giants were bringing home the World Series trophy. Right? So myths are important. They reinforce our views of the world, and we gain psychological well-being from this because it's comforting to know that we can trust in our beliefs. So Bob then goes on and he argues that games are myth-reinforcing entities as well. What he says is that for some it might simply be the need to bring order out of chaos. For them, Tetris is a fine way to reassert that belief. But Tetris can't reinforce the belief, for example, that it is better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all. If we want to reinforce deeper, more complex myths, which in turn can create deeper and more satisfying gameplay experiences, then we need to turn to stories. So reinforcing myths tickles our perceived sense of the idealized self, right? Over there in the person frame, which you might be able to see. And we see this in Fallout 3. Like, Fallout 3 is an interactive way of reliving the American dream, and you're actually building and you're shaping your own myth. So for Fallout 3, I would argue that if we're looking at the identity bubble, that this myth of the American dream and how fundamentally it's anchored in all identity frames unifies this identity bubble and pulls everything together. And I can actually make the same argument for Portal if we want to go back to it, because Portal at its very core is a monster in the house story. You know, we might say it's a retelling of the Labyrinth of Minos, but I think like this situation from Saw might resonate more, right? I mean, I still remember the first trailer for Saw. It was just a bunch of footage, and in the end it just says, this is fucked up. And I believe that. I mean, I'm so deeply afraid of a situation like this, where I'm trapped by this nihilistic monster, that the reason why I'm watching Saw is because I want to steel myself. And I want to reinforce this belief that if I'm in a situation like that, I would be able to survive. It's also about making you appreciate life and all that stuff, right? But Portal is more humorous in the way it tells its story, but fundamentally it's actually exactly the same story. It's a nihilistic monster, and finishing Portal reinforces exactly the same belief, but it does so interactively. This might be pretentious, but I actually believe that that's what we do and stuff. So I had ignored the person frame up to this point because it wasn't part of the magic circle. You know, it wasn't required for a working identity bubble. I think we can completely ignore it and create just games which are engrossment, like games that are fun for their own sake. So we were able to hook together a player and character without the person layer and without its help. With that said, we've just seen that engaging the person with its yearning for positive reinforcement can actually add meaning to our play experience. So that optional nature, I think, changes now because we're going to talk about vehicle games and we're going to talk about Uncharted 2 specifically. And I think we want to see how important this person is going to become. So I think I've already talked about the fact that Uncharted 2 is pretty much the exact opposite from something like Fallout 3, like both in structure and also in its identity approach, right? It's an active cinematic experience, highly structured. It's a story-driven game with strongly authored characters who constantly speak for themselves. They actually set goals, they propel the story forward, and so on. So just from everything we've seen so far, with such a strongly characterized avatar, we pretty much automatically open Pandora's box right there, right? I mean, we're opening this identity gap in the middle right there. Because with every self-motivated, unexpected step that the player didn't initiate and that the character takes, character and player are going to start drifting apart, right? It's hard to feel a sense of agency when your destiny isn't driven by your own actions, but the on-screen character just keeps doing his own thing. So the connection between player and character, I think, is going to be stretched very thin. It might even snap at times, right? Go away. So I think this is where the gamer's understanding of myths, like his collective unconscious, can come in and hold everything together. And the reason this works in the first place, well, it's explained in Bob's talk, right? We consume media to reinforce beliefs. So what I believe then is that the gamer's identity expectations are actually different for these kind of story-driven games. I mean, we've seen how Fallout 3 lets us build our own myth in an interactive way, which is awesome for our medium, because it does something different, but there is this traditional way as well. While we're watching movies, for example, it's going on somebody else's journey. I mean, and I think many players are going to willingly sacrifice agency or their player story to experience this kind of journey. And we might call it myth recall, if the other one is called myth building or myth shaping, right? We're going on somebody else's journey, and we're driving him through the experience, well, like a vehicle. So what this does is flipping around the way we create motivation in games. Like up until now, I've always stressed that motivation should be created in the player. Now if we turn this around, we're putting the player in a frame of mind where he doesn't mind following Nathan Drake, well, because he wants to be Nathan Drake, right? He knows Nathan Drake. Maybe not personally, but he's watched so much Indiana Jones movies that he knows exactly what this journey is about, right? Guess what? He wants to be Indiana Jones. He wants to be Nathan Drake. So this is wish fulfillment, right? And all games cater to this on a basic, in some shape or form, on a basic level. But this doesn't mean that it actually solves anything unless we execute it perfectly. Like, I don't want people to come away from this thinking, well, we just create a strongly characterized avatar based on a mythic archetype, and we're closing the identity gap. It's actually quite the opposite. I mean, this is where most bad stories come from in our games, because we keep acting like these guys instead of these guys. And as a result, we keep creating this kind of shit instead of this. So I didn't work on Uncharted 2. The guys who did some awesome presentations last year on the development of the game. So once again, I'm not here to analyze how they actually made the game. I just want to show how all of this fits into the idea of the identity bubble. So the thing is that gamers play games like Uncharted 2 because they want to experience what it's like to be Nathan Drake, right? And they understand this long list of archetypes that he's based on, most notably probably Alan Quatermain and Indiana Jones. So as developers then, we engage the perceived sense of idealized self-identity fragment, right? The player sees qualities of himself in a character like Nathan Drake, and then he looks for opportunity to reinforce this belief by playing the game. So the gamer's expectations of how this game should play out are very much shaped by his inherent knowledge of the underlying story. Right? So we need to create a story that actually follows those rules. If I was to sum up Uncharted 2's narrative, or like the rules underlying with just 3 screenshots, I could use Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade. Right? This is pretty much the story. So Uncharted 2 is a road movie. It's a story in which the journey is more important than the destination. And the fun thing is that it actually works in Uncharted 2's favor because, well, the same goes for the gamer's agency expectations, right? The journey is probably more important than unlimited expression. So our mythic understanding of the story is the glue that's holding all of this stuff together. You know, it buys us a bit of leeway because the journey isn't actually quite as unpredictable and unexpected as we think it might be. I mean, we know we're going to get to Shambhala in the end, right? The question is, how do we get there? And in fact, the one time identity didn't work for me in Uncharted 2 is when Nathan Drake was trying to end the journey. He was like somewhere in the Himalayas and he's saying, you know, I've had enough. I knew that wasn't true. That was the one time it actually didn't work. So on top of this, then Naughty Dog comes in and they invest an ungodly amount of attention to actually realign player and character as well. I think one of them is what Naughty Dog called the gap in one of those talks, is this idea that for each unexpected obstacle that we're throwing in the player's way, well, it wipes out all the information about the journey. It levels the playing field. It actually puts player and character on the same page because the information of what's ahead is actually wiped out. And the other thing they do is that when Nathan Drake does set a direction, like he says we have to go over there, it's always tied to a landmark. So now the player can dig his teeth into that. He can drive the action towards that landmark because he knows exactly where he's going. So all of this already brings character and player closely together, but it's very low frequency. It only happens like every 30 seconds or 30 minutes or something like that, right? So we need to do even more. And this is very similar to what we saw in Fallout 3. We also have to hook character and player together by fundamentally weaving the character's identity into what it means to play the game, into the core gameplay actions. So Nathan Drake is a treasure hunter at heart, right? The player acts out this character trait by searching for hidden treasure all over the place. Drake is clever. He has a knack for unraveling historic mysteries, and this is a trait that we act out as the player when we're solving all these puzzles. Now, he's doing it, but we're doing it with him. And finally, Drake is very resourceful, and I think that's fundamentally woven into the game's traversal gameplay, because we always get around situations nobody else was able to pass. We always find the most clever way to get somewhere. So, on a base level, Uncharted 2's gameplay actions are all geared towards reinforcing Nathan Drake's character, right? And they're all geared towards making this guy very happy. Like, when the player plays this game, he knows what it's like to be Drake, right? He almost feels like he's Nathan Drake, which is what he came for. So there's a very high level of identification here, but well, identification isn't a great term because I don't think it quite expresses what it means to play this game. What I want to call it instead is identity absorption. And this is a term that's coming from understanding comics. It's a concept where Scott McCloud talks about the fact that when we're driving a car, we always remain a separate entity from the car, and we understand that, right? But we often become so immersed in the driving experience that we start talking about the car in first person. We start saying, oh my God, he hit me. He's cutting me off. Well, guess what? Nathan Drake is a vehicle, right? He's a car. So I think exactly the same thing is happening right here. We don't become Nathan Drake, but we absorb his identity. I think that's a good explanation of how we actually relate to a very strongly characterized avatar like this. If I had to state the design goals for both of these identity approaches, I would say the puppet avatars are about creating high agency, and vehicle avatars about creating high identity absorption. And that's the reason why Uncharted 2 works. All right. So I hope these have been very divergent examples, right, of how we're actually creating player identity. And hopefully you've seen the underlying identity concepts, the double consciousness, and all that stuff shine through. So I want to finish this talk by just looking at some advice, some things that we can take away from this. So before you're even writing the story, just ask yourself the question, what does it mean to be X? What does it mean to be this character? And then try to fundamentally express that identity in gameplay. Because this way, this feeling of character is constantly reinforced because the player's gameplay actions keep aligning these two consciousness, right? I mean, this is not something where we just establish a hook between two identity frames and then they stay hooked together. These are impulses that we send. Those frames are always going to slowly drift apart, so we have to keep sending these little impulses that keep hooking them back together. And if your character identity is fundamentally anchored in the gameplay actions, you just keep doing this at a very high frequency. Just to show you how important this concept is, I want to look at BioShock 2. So this is my disclaimer that I really like BioShock 2, but this is the one game, this was an awesome game, but it had a really bad feeling of player identity because, BioShock 2 puts me into the role of a rogue Big Daddy, right? So I played BioShock 1, and I have a very, very clearly, narrowly defined idea of what Big Daddy stand for. They're these badass protectors of those little girls. And then BioShock 2 comes along, and it's very schizophrenic on this archetype. Right? On the one hand, many of the core gameplay actions treat me like I'm a human player. I'm eating fucking cream cakes and drinking coffee. I don't even know how. Does it go through the helmet to replenish my health? On the other hand, the game is expecting me to feel and sometimes act like a Big Daddy. That's the overriding motivation, actually, to get to the end of the story. But then it presents you with the choice of being able to harvest the little sisters, which once again is completely out of character. So as I'm playing BioShock 2, I have this really inconclusive treatment of the character's identity, and I think it starts like pricking needles into the identity bubble at a very high frequency, right? Because the moment-to-moment gameplay is communicating one thing, but then the overall story is communicating a completely different direction of what the character is about. So every time I eat a cream cake or harvest a little sister, character and player start just drifting apart a little bit more. And BioShock 2 was awesome, but I think at the third level or so, it had lost all sense of identity for me because I didn't know what it meant to be a Big Daddy. But the main lesson I want you to take away from this is just this understanding of double consciousness, with the character, player, and person model, and Harvey Smith's identity frames, which then form each, identity fragments, which form each of this frame. So I think most of bad game writing, 99%, whatever, can be traced back to just treating games like we're writing for other media. So hopefully you're able to explain to people why you shouldn't be doing that. And then I just hope to have imparted some concepts, some language we can use to come back and actually talk about games and about identity approaches. If you know about the identity, about this identity range, you can actually see where the games we talked about fall on this identity range, right? And there's a bunch more examples, which all just kind of show you where they belong. We can even use it to show how the approach changed between different games. The last game I worked on is Dead Space 2. Dead Space 1 is very much on the left side. Dead Space 2 comes along, adds a voice, it adds a lot of cutscenes and that kind of stuff to Isaac Clarke, and it falls much more into the vehicle category. Resistance was very similar, where the approach changed between game 1 and 2, and we added a voice. And all of this has been very much about action games, right? Because that's what I work on. You can actually use it for other genres as well, like Rock Band. The main Rock Band experience is all about building your own rock hood. But Rock Band's Beatles is all about reliving somebody else's journey. It's the vehicle Rock Band. And I know Guitar Hero is dead now, but there's even a distinction right there between Rock Band and Guitar Hero because, well, Guitar Hero was always about reliving, like collecting all of these rock stars and playing as them, right? So that's where the difference was there. So we can create a similar chart for the mythic quality of various games, right? Myth building, myth creation, and myth recalling. Once again, we got those games that we talked about in this talk, and there's a whole bunch of other games that fall into the spectrum as well. So if you've been tasked with coming up with a story, a character for a game, here's some quick closing thoughts on that. Figure out what kind of game you're making. Are you making a puppet game? Are you making a vehicle game? Are you making something in between? All approaches are valid. I subscribe to a certain philosophy, but in the industry, all of these approaches are valid, but they're going to guide what you should and shouldn't do, and you need to understand this. If you're going to make a puppet game, it might be nonlinear. It's going to have an emphasis on the player story. It's going to be about the player building his own myth. There might not be cutscenes because I think that would take away control from the player, and it's very much against that concept. If you're making a vehicle game, well, it's probably going to be highly structured, and it's going to be linear, and it's going to have an emphasis on myth recall. You might be able to use cutscenes, you probably can. You can use pre-authored character traits, and you can use those traits to propel the story forward. So I think puppet games are easier generally when it comes to just the identity approach. They're going to be much harder on various other levels. So if you are making a vehicle game, be very careful. Be 100% sure you understand what you're getting yourself into. Because I've kind of danced around the issue, but if you are making a vehicle game, you're making a fucking talking car, right? And those talking cars might have been awesome in the 80s, especially where I come from, but they can be annoying. They can even be completely unnecessary, right? I mean, just imagine you're driving down Highway 1 and you're witnessing this beautiful sunset over the Pacific Ocean. You're just sitting there, you're appreciating it, and all of a sudden you hear this voice saying, look at that beautiful sunset. And you realize, fuck, I'm sitting in my car is talking to me, and I'm not sure if this remark really enhanced the moment, right? I mean, it should probably be appreciated and experiencing quite appreciation. So you can do this, of course. I mean, this is a very personal decision. I'm just trying to point out that every time the character expresses a sentiment, and that's not shared by the player, well, you're widening the identity gap, right? You're making them drift apart. So finally, understand the underlying myth of the game. And this is especially important when you're creating a story-driven game. Like with a vehicle character, it's actually imperative. So you must identify and execute on the myth that the game will be based on, or it's going to feel aimless. The player won't really know where it's going, and it's going to feel hollow. And of course, this lecture can dive into the subject. We're pretty much done now. But if you are looking for some further reading, I suggest the late Blake Snyder's book, Save the Cat Goes to the Movie, which I think the Uncharted 2 team used as well. So both types, myth-building games like Fallout, right, or myth-recalling experience like Uncharted have merit. And I think players seek them out equally, but for completely different reasons. So as a designer, you need to understand the distinction between those types, and then take the differences into account when you're designing a game. But when it comes to myth reinforcement, I really believe in that, right? And I believe in it because I'm a game designer. And game design is kind of a black art. There aren't very many fundamental facts that I can hang my head on. Like, it's up to all of us here to come up with our own belief systems about what makes games work and what doesn't work. Then we might even go out and we're perusing the media landscape. We're finding various psychological text because, we want to reinforce that belief. We might come to specific GDC talks because, you know what, if they tell us what we believe in, it's very comforting to know that you can trust in your own beliefs. So this right here is my belief system on player identity, and I hope you found it useful. Maybe you can even make it your own. But no matter what, thanks very much for coming. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. If you do have a question, please use the microphones. And I want to remind you again to please return those feedback forms. I never bring a pen, so what I've been doing recently, I just use my fingernail to even just circle whatever you like. It's going to be helpful. So yes, if anybody has questions, please.
It seems from what you were saying about LUDONARRATIVE parity important, that in such an approach, the character motivations which have parity with the player's motivations could only be certain kinds of motivations that we have as players in games, about progression, challenge, overcoming obstacles, when he said, wouldn't it be great if Call of Duty was about duty?
Right.
Wouldn't it be great if Medal of Honor was about honor? Do you think that Ian Bogott's idea of procedural retro can't be used to bring those kinds of things into the player's motivations by designing the game system in such a way that it is about
Right.
those sorts of things?
So the question is just, do I believe that we need to use very primal motivation to actually achieve this ludonarrative parity? And do we need to use something that's more a vehicle game to achieve something like, well, what Clint Hawking's talking about? So I'm not going to disagree with Clint Hawking because he's my boss. And I don't actually want to express that at all. What I'm saying is that if you do have a primal motivation, something that a caveman understands, it's very easy for the player to understand how to act on that motivation. I don't have to explain it at all. If you do want to express hope in a game and you want to anchor that systemically, or duty or whatever, it's going to take much longer. It's going to take much more explanation. It's actually going to explain to you how those gameplay systems are tied together. I think I could talk about this for like 2 hours, but I'm not saying it's impossible. In fact, I think that's where we should go. I'm saying in the current landscape, in the way, just looking at the games we have right now, it's going to be, it's difficult, right? It's going to take you hours and hours to actually establish the framework, actually getting the player into the world of the game to understand how he might act on duty. It's going to take you several hours just to establish the duty in the first place, because all this inherent understanding that defines us in the world, right? I'm going to feel duty to my country because I've lived there for 35 years. I need to cram that into at least 2-3 hours or whatever in the game to actually get to the point where that matches what would be going on in the real world. So that's more what I was trying to say. Yes? So the question is, the reason why I'm taking an academic approach, or seemingly academic approach to this, because we're lacking like that kind of language as an industry. Right? Honestly, I'm just talking about it. I think what's really humbling when you're doing these kind of talks is that everything you want to talk about actually is expressed somewhere in rules of play. Right? We do have all this academia, and it's out there. All the information is out there. The way I talk about this just is kind of colored by that. If I'm finding these kind of things in rules of play, if I'm finding it in shared fantasy, which was written by academics to a varying degree, at least that gives us language. At least that gives us a certain way to talk about stuff. So, yes, ludonarrative parity is not something I want to say more than 5 times. Having to say myth reinforcement, which has a fucking TH at the end, has been a real chore just talking about in this talk. But if that's language we can use, to come back next GDC and start talking about the concepts, then I'm all for that. So that's where that comes from. Mm-hmm.
How do you think the identity bubble changes when you go to a game that may not have voiceovers or type graphics or even text?
Well, I think it goes into something that Ken Hudson talked about on Wednesday night, actually. Everybody can look it up. He was talking about exactly that. How do we get gamer or player-derived narrative? And what are he talked about it for 10 minutes, how you take something that's in a high AAA production, like high-value cutscene, and how we might be able to get around that. So I think there's various ways we can go about that. Like the one thing I'm going to mention, Ken was talking about use voice synthesis, right? You might not have an human character, you might have a computer or something. So if you need to generate large amounts of text or voice or whatever, build your story around that. So we just have to be clever about it. I think that I love Uncharted 2, Dead Space 2 very much goes in the same direction. I think it's going to be a road where we're going to wear ourselves out at some point, because we have to keep piling and piling and piling on top. And what we're doing by this, we're not even creating something that's inherently new to our medium. It doesn't really play to our strengths. The only thing we can do in an experience like that is be a movie, but interactively. So I think that adds a little bit of meaning on top of it, because we've actually done something. We've actually taken the ring to Mordor instead of just watch somebody doing it. but it's like a delta of 20% or something on top of it. So I think as the future goes, we need to go to more of a Fallout experience. We need to go into something that's more complementary, ludonarrative, parity, stuff like that.
So you think that one of the only ways to create a stronger bonding between this identity bubble between the player and the character and the person is to have more and more realistic graphics?
No, it's what I'm not trying to say. Sorry if that's how it came along, then I just did a terrible, terrible job. No, the way we get to this identity bubble is expressing what the story is about in gameplay actions. That's the simple answer. We need to make sure we know what it means to be that character, and what it means to be that character, what his motivation is about, needs to be expressed in gameplay. Because otherwise, you're completely floating on two different tracks. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there was this huge disparity, most of that found because we had Jack Black, and Jack Black was faithful and became about Jack Black.
Mm-hmm.
And Schaefer had this idea from the very beginning that it was about being heroic and being out of stuff. How do you minimize the effects of bringing in a new actor and changing the character that much?
Well,
You have this set idea of,
I love Brutal Legend for the reason that when it comes to identity, like what I'm doing in the game is totally expressed in his identity, right? There's this complementary match the entire time. I'm a roadie. I know what it means to organize an army. So the entire game is about organizing an army in a slightly different context. So that part is cool. My honest answer would be don't hire Jack Black, right? I mean, it's the same problem you're going to have. I like Jack Black, but it's the same problem you're going to have when he does Kung Fu Panda or something like that. Can I see a panda or do I see Jack Black doing that? I mean, unless you really engross the player in the experience and make him forget that it's Jack Black, and if that's really like a sticking point, that's really important, then I would say, well, go to an anonymous voice actor. I don't know if that's an awesome answer, but I mean, that's how I think it's so personal, right? Some people can't see past Jack Black. Other people are going to think it's awesome because Jack Black actually stands for something. He actually involves the person in a way, because I understand what he stands for, right? He's all about rock appreciation, stuff like that. So for other people, it might have worked perfectly. Yeah. Okay, I think one more question. Thanks. Yep. I ran out of time. I mean, I think when we're looking at this is an awesome model for modeling addiction, right? Like if you do create a strongly characterized avatar, like a vehicle game more or less, and let's say he's an alcoholic, right? And the way you play the game, you need to make sure it has two tracks, right? At the very end, not like divergent tracks, but at the very end, you're going to go through the story regardless, but you're either going to put him in the loony bin, you're going to turn him into somebody who's completely raging alcoholic, or you actually allow him to slowly get off that. The way you do that then, and I think that's where Bioshock 2 specifically failed, is you make that a value choice which is asymmetrical. You make sure that you give the player a lot of systemic value for drinking more and more alcohol. Right? So if he goes through the game drinking more and more alcohol, it's going to turn the player character, the avatar, into this alcoholic, which is bad, but it's going to give him a lot of benefits. On the other hand, if I want to play the game in a way that it's actually going to heal this guy from alcoholism, and I'm still going to get to the end, but it's going to be much harder to do, well, that's the other part. That's the value choice right there. So I think we're going to find, I don't know what the exact distribution was for the Little Sisters. I mean, what the problem with Bioshock was that ultimately, harvesting or not harvesting the Little Sisters was systemically exactly the same. But I think that's where you start. That's where you start. You then go into a room and ask how many people turned him into an alcoholic, how many people tried to maintain this equilibrium, and how many people just said, you know what, I'm going to be good. I had to put in much more work, but hey guys, I'm a fucking angel because, I went through all this hardship because my digital character, came out and he got back his family and did all that stuff. So, yeah. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest.